In the election of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York, was elected President of the United States. FDR, which is what I'll call him for the rest of this presentation, promised the people of the United States a New Deal for America. In this chapter, we will discuss what that New Deal meant and how it has affected this great country. The Democratic Party chooses FDR as their candidate in 1932 for several reasons. He is reform-minded, which means he was naturally inclined towards change. He seems like a friendly guy, very important, which if you want to be president, and probably why I will never be president. He was also able to exude confidence, which must have been quite hard considering he couldn't walk and had to have a wheelchair to get around. It didn't hurt that he was a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt or that he was married to Teddy's favorite niece. It's amazing that they were from New York. With a family tree like that, you would think they were from Alabama or Mississippi. By winning the Democratic nomination for president, FDR was basically a sure bet to win. If you'll remember from last chapter, the Republican Party had been in power for most of the 1920s, and the American public was blaming them for the economic troubles. Because of that, the Democrats not only won the White House, they also took heavy majorities in the Senate and the House. In 1933, the president was not inaugurated until March. Compare that to January 21st today. That leaves nearly 5 months until FDR is actually made president. In that time, FDR met with what he called his Brain Trust in order to formulate his plan for the New Deal. The Brain Trust was a group of advisors to FDR that helped him come up with a plan to reboot the economy. When FDR finally takes office in March of 1933, he will immediately implement his plan in the form of relief for the poor, economic recovery laws, and financial reform. The first 100 days of FDR's presidency was the most important. In that short period of time, 15 major New Deal laws were passed. The first major act passed under FDR was the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The Emergency Banking Relief Act called for a bank holiday. A bank holiday is where the government closes all banks in the country for a short period of time in order to inspect their overall health. The goal is to figure out which banks need to close, which need help, or which ones are just fine. When banks are allowed to reopen, the public has confidence that they are healthy enough to put their hard-earned money in because the government has deemed them so. Shortly after entering the Oval Office, FDR began giving what he called fireside chats. In the 1930s, most families would gather around their radios each night to listen to the news, music, and ball games for entertainment. FDR would give speeches that were broadcast all over the country. In these talks, FDR explained the purpose of the New Deal laws and asked for support of the government while they tried to fix the economy. If you'll remember from last chapter, I told you that after the crash of 1929, most of America lost all of their life savings when the banks failed. It didn't matter that it wasn't their fault that the system failed. Their money just no longer existed. One of the first things done by FDR's New Deal was to protect money deposited in the bank. The Glass-Steagall Act established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. By the way, there will be a lot of acronyms used in this chapter. The FDIC insures individual bank accounts up to a certain amount. This still exists today. If you look on the window of every bank as you walk in, there's a decal that says, Member FDIC. In today's world, the FDIC will insure accounts up to $250,000 per person per account. So, when you become rich, right after you give your favorite teacher, Coach Armstrong, a big check for helping you find your way in life, only put $250,000 in each account you have, just in case the banks fail again. The Federal Securities Act forced all companies to give all information on their stock and created the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. Not that SEC, guys. This SEC was created to regulate the stock market, not dominate the college football world. Here's where we start getting into the alphabet soup. The New Deal was also designed to help farmers and workers. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, was created to raise crop prices and lower the supply so that farmers would make more money. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, was created jobs by renovating or building dams in the South. I won't go through each of these because you can read what each of them does. The New Deal was not immune to criticism. There were quite a few people that were opposed to the program. The conservatives in the country are upset with the extreme amounts of deficit spending. Deficit spending is when the government spends more money than it takes in. All of those New Deal programs take lots of money. The government was creating jobs and providing relief through government spending. Conservatives also felt that the government regulation of business was an attempt to create a socialist economy in the United States. Some liberals, on the other hand, felt that the New Deal wasn't doing enough to help the poor or fix the economy. You just can't please everybody. The U.S. Supreme Court also became a problem for the FDR administration. The Supreme Court ruled a couple of New Deal laws unconstitutional. FDR was upset and afraid that more of the New Deal would be undone by the Supreme Court. So FDR proposed a bill that would pack the Supreme Court. As there are today, there were 9 Supreme Court justices. FDR proposed to up that number to 15. If the bill passes, FDR would then be able to appoint 6 new judges. This would give him a liberal majority in the Supreme Court and keep him from having to worry about his laws being overruled. Pretty much everybody, including most of his advisors, disagreed with this tactic. FDR backed off of his proposal. No matter, though, by the end of his tenure as president, which was from 1933 to 1945, FDR will appoint 7 judges to the Supreme Court of the United States. As I said on the last slide, there were plenty of critics to the New Deal. On the conservative side, some critics created the American Liberty League. They felt that the New Deal violated personal rights and property rights. On the liberal side, Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest, wanted the New Deal to provide guaranteed incomes to everyone and nationalize the banks. Dr. Francis Townsend wanted a pension plan for the elderly. FDR's most threatening critic, though, was Huey Long, a politician from Louisiana. Huey Long had some very popular ideas. And had he not been killed by one of his son's political enemies before the 1936 election, he could have given FDR a run for his money. Next time you go to New Orleans, pay attention to the name on the bridge over Lake Pontchartrain. It's named after Huey Long. The New Deal helped, but the problem was still not solved. Last chapter I told you that Depression lasts from 1929 to 1940. So all the stuff we just talked about and the stuff we're about to talk about don't fix the problem. They do, however, make things better, and even more importantly, they have a huge impact on the country today. As I said just a second ago, the recovery wasn't what everybody had hoped, so FDR had to up the effort. In the second phase, known as the Second New Deal, FDR works to help farmers and workers. This new phase was heavily influenced by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Miss Roosevelt becomes the model for First Ladies today. In the 1936 election, Democrats win large majorities in the House and Senate, as well as the White House. The election shows that the country supports what is being accomplished. For the first time in history, most African Americans vote Democrat. African Americans had been long voting for the Republicans because it was the party of Lincoln, the president that had freed the slaves. In 1936, Congress passed the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, which replaced the AAA. It rewarded farmers for practicing soil conservation. This was an attempt to help farmers bring an end to the Dust Bowl. Congress also passes a new AAA without the wording that got it ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The other 2 acts on this page were passed to give loans to farmers so that they could buy land. The FSA hired photographers to take pictures of rural towns, farmers, and farms. You saw one of those photos in the activity you did with the picture of the mother and her children last chapter. The Works Progress Administration was created to create jobs for urban workers. They built airports, roads, and tunnels, one of which is the Bankhead Tunnel downtown. That's the old tunnel on Government Street. The WPA also employed women to sew clothes for the needy and provided work for writers, artists, and performers. The National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, was passed to protect unions and prohibit unfair labor practices. The Fair Labor Standard Act sets maximum hours and the minimum wage, which at that time was like a quarter. I'm sure most of you, well, probably all of you, have a Social Security number. In 1935, the Social Security Act created a system that provides insurance for the retired, aid for the disabled, and unemployment compensation. Social Security was designed to help people who couldn't work. The government worked to provide jobs by expanding public utilities. Without the help of the government, there wouldn't be enough of a reason to spend the money to provide power to rural farms. It costs a lot of money to run power lines to houses in the middle of nowhere. The government decided that they could kill two birds with one stone by running those power lines and providing jobs to run them. The New Deal was meant to provide aid. It is important to look at how these measures affected the different groups within the United States. Women made some important strides during the New Deal era. Frances Perkins was appointed as Secretary of Labor and became the first female cabinet member in United States history. FDR also appoints 2 women as diplomats and 1 as a federal judge. Despite gaining these positions, women were still discriminated against. The minimum wage is set lower for women, federal work programs hire very few women, and women's wages only increase slightly throughout the period. FDR also helps the cause for African Americans by appointing over 100 to government positions. FDR also creates his Black Cabinet, which is an unofficial group of African American advisors. He may have appointed African Americans and put together a group of African American advisors, but FDR was reluctant to push for civil rights. FDR was afraid to upset Southern Democrats because he needed them to pass his New Deal laws. He also refused to approve an anti-lynching law that would make lynching a federal crime or end the poll tax. New Deal agencies discriminated against African Americans by paying them less and favoring whites in hiring. Despite all of this, African Americans still support the New Deal and FDR. During the New Deal era, labor unions flourish. Laws are passed that strengthen unions and membership increases from 3 million to 10 million. In order to win strikes, labor unions use a new tactic called a sit-down strike. Sit-down strike is where instead of a worker leaving their workstation, they stay where they are and quit working. If they don't leave and don't work, scabs can't come in and take their work from them. When things get bad, we all look to whatever form of entertainment we like the most to take us out of the real world. I think we can all agree that the Depression was much tougher than anything we have ever experienced in our lives. The entertainment that comes out of the 1930s is both used to escape reality and show the Depression's devastation. Movies were the biggest attraction during the 1930s. 65% of the population goes to the movies at least once a week. Movies provide an escape from the reality of everyday life. A couple of the most famous movies of the time are Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. As I stated earlier, the radio was a very important part of almost every American family. Families would gather around the radio to listen to news, variety shows, and dramas. Soap operas became popular during the 1930s. They were marketed towards housewives like they are today. The reason they're called soap operas is because they were originally sponsored by soap companies. The government starts to pay artists to paint murals, make sculptures, and teach. One of the first things to lose funding during an economic downturn is usually the arts. The 1930s is a hotbed of art because the government dedicated funds to make sure artists continued to work. In order to make sure that writers could still make money during the Depression, the federal government created the Federal Writers Project. The FWP was the breeding ground for some of the most iconic writers in American history, one of which is John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which described what life was like during the Dust Bowl. Another book that Steinbeck wrote that most of you have probably read before is Of Mice and Men. I am fully aware that most of this chapter is boring. For goodness sakes, the entire era is called the Great Depression. The reason you are required to learn about this mind-numbingly boring stuff is because of its legacy. The Depression and the New Deal mean so much to your everyday life. The New Deal programs created in a time of great need have lasted into the present and continue to affect our economy today. By 1937, the economy finally starts to show signs of improvement, and the government begins scaling back its programs. By 1939, the New Deal is considered over. To this day, conservatives and liberals debate whether the New Deal had a positive or negative effect on today's economy. Conservatives feel that FDR's programs made the federal government way too big and put the country on a path towards a socialistic welfare state. That basically means they think the New Deal caused people in our country to rely on the government instead of themselves for their everyday needs. Liberals feel that the New Deal didn't do enough. They think we should have gone completely socialist. They argue that capitalism in any form leads to massive inequalities. People that supported the New Deal feel that it helped the United States recover and survive the Depression. One thing is for certain, the New Deal definitely gave more power to the federal government and the office of the president. It also sent the government deeply into debt. I told you earlier that the New Deal gave jobs through the government spending money they didn't have. This only continued during World War II. The New Deal doesn't end the Depression, but the spending during World War II did end it. All the things described on this slide, the NLRB, the SEC, again, not that SEC, and the FDIC still to this day work to protect you from the abuses that led to the Great Depression. One of the most controversial parts of the New Deal that still exists today is Social Security. Each and every year, politicians debate the necessity and funding for the program. As it currently works, the Social Security system will dry up at about the same time I am set to retire. To make a long story short, Social Security used to have more money in it than it needed at the time, but it would need it later. The government decided that it could use that money somewhere else, so they took loans out of the Social Security system with the intention of paying it back later. Well, guess what? They have yet to pay it back, and that debt is part of the $17+ trillion debt we are in today. The Great Depression and the New Deal left far-reaching legacies. They have influenced how we have governed this nation ever since. What I find so fascinating about this period of history is how the government is always trying to prevent these things from happening again, yet they still do. I also love how you can interpret this era in several different ways. The New Deal can be seen as something that helped the country weather a terrible economic storm, or it can be viewed as the reason we have economic issues today. It's all up to your interpretation.